In today's interconnected world, it is easy to overshare and expose ourselves to others, both in person and through the ever-present realm of social media. While openness and vulnerability can be valuable in building meaningful relationships and fostering empathy, the ancient philosophy of Stoicism reminds us of the importance of guarding certain aspects of our lives. In this video, I'll be addressing certain personal matters and situations that are best kept private, things that don't serve any purpose in being shared. Privacy holds significance in your life, both strategically and for cultivating inner peace. For those who follow us for Stoic or philosophical insights, rest assured, this video will guide you in embodying Stoicism in today's world. Before we begin, kindly ensure you are subscribed to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any empowering content. And as always, be the best version of yourself. 1. The battles you fought in the past. There's no need for others to grasp. In the journey of life, there are battles we fight, struggles we endure, and challenges we overcome that may remain concealed within the depths of our hearts. These personal battles, the battles you fought in the past, need not be fully comprehended by others. There's no obligation to justify yourself to those who have trodden their own arduous paths. Attempting to elucidate the full extent of your struggles may inadvertently appear presumptuous, as if seeking validation for your experiences. The essence of one's character is profoundly shaped by the trials and tribulations they have weathered. However, it is not incumbent upon you to make these trials common knowledge or lean upon your hardships as an excuse or a narrative. Those challenging moments have been the crucible in which your life was forged, contributing to your character's maturity, wisdom, and unyielding perseverance. While your past has molded you, there is no need for others to vividly visualize the pain you've endured. What they truly need to recognize is your growth and transformation. Ultimately, it's more commendable for someone to refrain from dwelling excessively on their past and instead be fully present in the present moment. It is through actions, not words, that one truly demonstrates their qualities and experiences. It is not about boasting about one's past experiences, but rather about manifesting their capabilities in action, showing their inner strength and resilience. In doing so, they transcend a mere narrative of triumph and become a living testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Imagine a man named David who has had to face numerous. Rather than talking extensively about past difficulties, David proved through his actions that he had faced battles and emerged as a strong and valuable member of society. 2. The specifics of your goals are better left unshared. It's often wiser not to share the detailed intricacies of your aspirations. While most people may be aware of the general direction you're headed in, imagine the consequences of revealing precise details that expose every step of your journey. It's akin to granting unrestricted access to your personal phone. By doing so, you essentially relinquish control over the situation. If something doesn't go as planned, you may find yourself questioning whether it was your own misstep or if someone betrayed your trust. The origin of the attack, should one occur, becomes a mystery, as there are so many potential sources of harm that it becomes impossible to discern who might be responsible. Whether it's a well-meaning friend inquiring about your goals or someone with ulterior motives, safeguarding the crucial details of your objectives is of utmost importance. In fact, indicating the general direction in which you're heading is usually sufficient. You needn't feel obligated to divulge the intricate details of your journey to anyone. After all, nobody else can truly be your confidant in the same way you can be for yourself. Your path is uniquely yours, and you don't owe anyone a detailed explanation of your goals. It's more than adequate for only you to possess intimate knowledge about your own journey. Imagine you are a sculptor working on a unique and precious piece of art. Everyone around you knows that you are creating a sculpture, but you haven't revealed any details about it. You only say that the sculpture will be a magnificent work of art and that it will be special. One day, you decide to disclose more details about your sculpture to a close friend because you trust them. You describe every detail about its shape, size, and significance. However, after some time, you realize that detailed information about your sculpture has leaked out. Others know everything about your sculpture, and some are trying to copy it or even deceive to steal your effort. In this case, revealing too many details about your sculpture has led to you losing control and risking the sculpture being copied or stolen. If you simply let others know that you are creating a special sculpture without disclosing detailed information, you can protect your artwork and maintain its surprise and unique value. 3. Your happiness. Believing that joy and a sense of lightness are scarce, these emotions have become highly coveted. And when you genuinely radiate happiness, it can have a profound impact. People may react in various ways, some with admiration and others with skepticism. To some, your genuine smile may be a source of wonder, while others may question your sincerity, finding it hard to believe that someone can truly experience inner peace. In such a climate, it's important to proudly display your happiness. When someone inquires about your well-being, there's no need to downplay your contentment. Instead of merely stating that you're doing well, you can confidently express that you are indeed doing well. It's a subtle shift, but it conveys a sense of self-assurance and positivity. Rather than dwelling on how everything in your life is going swimmingly, it's perfectly acceptable to mention that things are going fine. In a world often overshadowed by despair and discontent, exuding happiness can sometimes be seen as a risky endeavor. Bitter and dissatisfied individuals may attempt to disrupt the serenity of those who have found inner peace. However, embracing and sharing your happiness is a courageous act that can inspire others to seek their own sources of joy and lightness. In a society where negativity often prevails, your genuine happiness can be a beacon of hope and a reminder that inner peace is attainable even in challenging times. So don't hesitate to let your happiness shine and be a source of inspiration for those around you. Imagine a person named John, a Christian, living in a challenging and anxious period. John has found faith in God to be a source of encouragement and hope in his life. He always appears happy and optimistic in his daily life, and John's smile always shines through during difficult times. When you inquire about John's situation, he will never say that everything is perfect. Instead, he will say that everything is okay with a smile. This is not to hide the truth, but to express his gratitude for his faith and his ability to overcome all difficulties. However, not everyone in John's life easily accepts this. Some people may be skeptical and find it hard to believe that someone can truly be happy amidst hardships. They may see John as overly optimistic and question his sincerity. Nevertheless, what's important is that John pays no attention to this doubt and continues to spread his happiness and hope. John is not just a believer in God, but also someone who expresses his faith through happiness and optimism. He doesn't try to make his life perfect, but instead impresses others with his gratitude and positive spirit. However, he also has to face the skepticism and dissatisfaction of those around him. This can be inevitable when you choose to live a positive life in a world full of challenges. Nevertheless, John chooses to stay true and not let others' negativity disrupt his spirit. 4. The importance of protecting privacy in the context of nurturing a healthy and strong romantic relationship. There's a vital principle that often goes unnoticed: the importance of safeguarding your relationship's privacy and avoiding unnecessary discussions about conflicts and intimate details on the public platform of the internet. It's a practice that can significantly contribute to the resilience and longevity of your bond. When conflicts or issues arise within a relationship, the instinct to vent or seek advice from friends and acquaintances can be strong. However, it's crucial to pause and reflect on the implications of this action. Sharing your relationship's intimate details with others, especially on the internet, can inadvertently weaken the very foundation you're trying to strengthen. Imagine you and your partner facing a challenge in your relationship. There is an important issue that both of you need to address, and it is causing tension and unease in your emotional life. Instead of sitting down and discussing this issue directly with each other, you decide to share everything with a close friend. You feel the need for advice and support from an outside perspective to resolve this problem. You tell your friend about what's happening, your emotions, and your hope to gain a different perspective. However, unfortunately, things take an unexpected turn. When you share your story, your friend starts offering their own comments and opinions. They begin to ask why you are in this relationship, give suggestions on how you should handle the issue, and even express concerns about your partner. Gradually, the conversation shifts towards your friend's opinions and viewpoints, and you feel like the initial issue has been sidelined. Instead of focusing on how to address the specific situation and improve your relationship, the conversation turns into a discussion of external perspectives and opinions. Effective communication and intimacy are the cornerstones of a successful and thriving relationship. However, they are most effective when cultivated within the relationship itself, rather than outside of it. Many people find themselves grappling with marital discord, and in their quest for resolution, they turn to friends, family, or even the online community. In doing so, they inadvertently transform their private problems into public gossip. Acknowledging this, it becomes evident that the health of your relationship hinges on your ability to maintain a delicate balance between intimacy and privacy. It means being able to resolve issues and navigate conflicts without divulging every intricate detail of your relationship to the outside world. In essence, the strength of your bond is nurtured within the sacred space you and your partner create together. It's a space where open and honest communication thrives, where you can address conflicts directly, and where intimacy flourishes. By refraining from sharing every aspect of your relationship with others, you preserve the sanctity of this space and ensure that it remains a source of strength and support for both you and your partner. So remember, while seeking advice and support is valuable, it's equally important to protect the privacy and intimacy that make your relationship truly special. 5. Your financial situation. Firstly, it's important to remember that nobody within your social circle is an IRS agent or a bank employee, so there's no need to share intimate financial details. Secondly, revealing your financial status, regardless of whether you are financially secure or in debt, can lead to unwelcome consequences. If you happen to be in a position of financial abundance, disclosing this information may attract individuals with ulterior motives who see you as a potential source of financial assistance. Conversely, if your finances are strained and you openly admit to it, many may view you with disdain, as societal norms often equate financial success with personal worth. It's simply how the world operates, and it's important to tread carefully. Therefore, the most effective approach is to maintain an air of mystery surrounding your financial situation. Let people speculate as they wish, while you remain enigmatic about your financial status. By doing so, you'll ensure that those close to you aren't overly concerned about your financial standing. Revealing desperation or financial hardship can jeopardize your opportunities and cause people to distance themselves from you. Whether it's in a job interview, a social gathering, or spending time with friends, displaying desperation will only create problems. Desperation not only disrupts the atmosphere, but also makes you appear burdensome to others. Remember, desperation won't help you achieve your goals. In fact, it will likely repel the very assistance you may need the most. So if you ever find yourself contemplating revealing a lack of financial control to others, it's often wiser to maintain your privacy and avoid such attempts. In summary, acting with poise and confidence is crucial. It holds significant weight in how you're perceived by others. Keep in mind that the world places great value on appearances. Even if you're internally uncertain or facing financial challenges, projecting confidence is the key to convincing people that you're in command. And 6, personal relationships and confidences. Stoicism, as a philosophy, places significant emphasis on the value of preserving trust and loyalty within personal relationships. In the Stoic view, revealing the confidences and vulnerabilities of others can have detrimental consequences, ultimately leading to the erosion of trust and the weakening of the very foundations upon which our relationships are built. Stoics firmly endorse the principles of discretion and integrity when entrusted with the private secrets and vulnerabilities of others. They understand that our handling of such confidences not only speaks to our own character, but also reflects our moral integrity and the core values we uphold. In the Stoic perspective, it is incumbent upon us to act with prudence and respect in matters of confidentiality, recognizing that the trust others place in us is a testament to our virtue and our commitment to the well-being of those around us. By exercising discretion and safeguarding the confidences of others, we not only demonstrate our ethical strength, but also contribute to the flourishing of robust and enduring relationships built on a foundation of trust and loyalty. This Stoic principle serves as a reminder that our actions in handling the confidences of others are a direct reflection of our own character and moral standing in the eyes of both ourselves and the wider world. Imagine you have a close friend who confides in you about the difficulties and worries in their personal life. They have shared their secrets and deep emotions with you in absolute trust. What's important is that you have promised to keep this information confidential and committed to standing by them in any situation. However, later on, you receive a phone call from another friend requesting you to share the information you know with them. You find yourself in a morally challenging situation because you have committed to keeping the first friend's secret. In this situation, if you adhere to Stoic principles, you would decline to share the information with the second friend, protecting the trust and confidentiality of the first friend. 7. Maintain ethics and personal values. Stoicism serves as a guiding light, emphasizing the unwavering importance of upholding our moral integrity and values, regardless of the external influences or societal expectations that may seek to divert us from our true principles. In a world where conformity and the pursuit of external approval often tempt individuals to forsake their deeply held beliefs, Stoicism acts as a timeless philosophy, steadfastly encouraging us to stay true to our commitment to virtue and ethical conduct in the face of the ever-present pressures of society. Stoicism implores us to stand resolute and unyielding, refusing to compromise our core values or convictions merely to conform to the prevailing norms or to appease public opinion. It reminds us that our moral compass should remain unshaken, serving as our unwavering guide in navigating the complex waters of life's challenges and temptations. By adhering to this Stoic wisdom, we not only maintain our moral purity, but also set an inspiring example for others, demonstrating the strength and fortitude of character that can emerge from a steadfast dedication to living in accordance with our highest ideals and principles. In essence, Stoicism is a philosophical beacon that calls upon us to cultivate an inner strength that transcends the transient fluctuations of external circumstances and societal pressures. It teaches us that our values and moral fiber should remain unaltered regardless of the storms of public opinion or the allure of conformity. In the profound words of the Stoic philosophers, we find the timeless reminder that in the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, we must hold fast to our principles and resist the ever-present currents that threaten to pull us away from the path of righteousness. Through the enduring philosophy of Stoicism, we discover the means to preserve our moral compass and, in doing so, to lead lives of true integrity and authenticity. Imagine a person named Alex, a Christian living in a society where greed and fierce competition have become widespread behaviors. Alex has always lived a life based on respect, tolerance, and love for others, values that the Bible has taught and upheld. However, in the current social environment, the pressure to succeed at all costs and accumulate material wealth often confronts Alex. One day, while the 7 aspects mentioned above form the core of what Stoicism advises us not to expose to others, there are additional facets of Stoic wisdom that can provide further guidance in navigating the complexities of life and relationships. Firstly, negative judgments and gossip. Stoicism encourages us to refrain from making negative judgments about others and engaging in gossip. Passing judgment and engaging in gossip can be detrimental to our own character and harm our relationships. The Stoics believe that when we criticize or gossip about others, we are not only exposing our own flaws in character, but also contributing to a negative and toxic atmosphere. By abstaining from negative judgments and gossip, we maintain our moral integrity and foster healthier interactions with others. Secondly, fear of death and mortality. Stoicism addresses the fear of death and our mortality. While it is natural to contemplate our mortality, constant preoccupation with death can lead to anxiety and a sense of despair. Stoicism teaches us to accept the inevitability of death as a part of the human condition. By acknowledging our mortality and not constantly dwelling on it, we can live more fully in the present, focusing on the things we can control and the virtues we can cultivate. Thirdly, past regrets and resentments. Another aspect of Stoic wisdom is the importance of not dwelling on past regrets and resentments. Holding on to grudges or endlessly ruminating on past mistakes can weigh us down emotionally and mentally. Stoics advocate for acknowledging our past actions and learning from them, but not allowing them to define our present or future. By practicing forgiveness and letting go of resentments, we free ourselves from the emotional burdens of the past. Finally, personal achievements and successes. While it may seem counterintuitive, Stoicism advises us not to boast about our personal achievements and successes. The philosophy values humility and modesty, teaching us that genuine success lies in living virtuously and not in seeking external validation or recognition. By avoiding excessive self-promotion, we maintain our humility and focus on the path of virtue. In peace and contentment, Stoicism places a high premium on inner peace and contentment. In a world filled with external distractions and desires, Stoicism reminds us that true happiness is found within ourselves. By not exposing our inner peace and contentment to external circumstances or seeking them through material possessions, we become more resilient and self-reliant in our pursuit of a well-lived life. Stoicism offers a comprehensive framework for living a life of wisdom, virtue, and tranquility. While it advises us not to expose certain aspects of our lives to others, it also emphasizes the importance of cultivating qualities such as discretion, humility, and resilience. By following these Stoic principles, we can navigate the complexities of our modern world with grace and integrity, fostering meaningful relationships and finding fulfillment in our pursuit of a life well lived. In an age where oversharing and external validation often dominate our interactions, Stoicism serves as a timeless reminder that true happiness and virtue begin within ourselves. Thank you for watching this video. We look forward to hearing from you. Of the 7 things you shouldn't reveal to others, which one impresses you the most? Please share in the comment section below. If you found this video useful, please like and share it with people you think could benefit from it. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so yet. We hope you will continue to follow us and learn and grow together.